Hi, thanks for tuning in to QuickTalk, the MedTech startup podcast. I'm Axel Strömriksson, Vice President at Viva MedTech. In this episode, we're going to dive into talk about how your device will be paid for once in commercial distribution. So we're going to talk about reimbursement, coding, payments, and things of that nature. With me, I have Steve St. George, and he spent about 20 years dealing with these type of questions. He's also the founder and CEO of Askelon Market Access. Hi, Steve. Welcome to Quick Talk. Super excited to have you here today. As you know, today we're going to cover a pretty complicated area around how your device is going to be paid for, including reimbursement, coding, and payment, and things of that nature. So it's definitely an area that I don't know a lot about. So very happy to have you here today. But before we jump in and start talking about that, please provide your background, a bit about yourself, and also why you started Askelon Market Access.
Sure. Well, thanks, Axel. Thanks for the invite. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm always excited to talk about reimbursement. It's kind of my passion. I think there's an awful lot going on here, and it's never boring to me. Hopefully, I can make it interesting to the audience as well. The medical device reimbursement roles really have kind of been my second career. The first act was many years within the health insurance industry, working in a variety of roles. But since I joined the medical device industry, I've had the opportunities to work for three Fortune 500 companies. Got to experience a startup kind of from early on, and also had several years with a consulting firm. But most recently, I started my own firm, Askelon Market Access. And really, my mission is to provide consulting services to help medical device companies navigate the reimbursement landscape.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, definitely a good background for today's topic. To kind of start us off, to kind of lay the land here, let's start talk about who purchases your medical device and then
Sure.
how reimbursement factors in there. So what are some of the different scenarios that startups may consider from this perspective?
Sure. Sure. Well, I think the kind of the most straightforward pathway would be when the device is purchased by directly by the patient, and the patient pays for it out of pocket. That can be very easy, but of course, it also puts a pretty big burden on the patient, especially when you have a more expensive device.
Right.
The other option really is to sell directly to the hospital or to a clinician who uses the device as part of a procedure. And then that's really probably the most common for most of the device companies that are contemplating getting into the market out there. Um, the interesting part is that one avenue does not really mean that you can't do it the other way as well. I know that, for instance, one of the companies I worked for had a snoring and sleep apnea device, and it was indicated for both snoring and sleep apnea. On the snoring side, since most insurance companies consider snoring to be a cosmetic issue, it was never going to be reimbursed. So that was a patient out-of-pocket purchase of that device. On the sleep apnea side, of course, that is a medical condition that insurance companies do pay for. So our challenge was, let's get that reimbursed for that indication. So one of the questions would be, so how does reimbursement factor into all of this? And I think the important part to remember is that when a provider purchases a device and that device either costs them more money or it replaces some other supply within the procedure, they're going to want to know how is that going to be reimbursed, and what does it do to the bottom line for that provider. So this is really key, I think, from the perspective of market access, that if it's not paid for, hospitals and physicians will be reluctant to pay for that device or use that device because they'll be out the money if it's not reimbursed by the insurance company.
Right, right. No, that's really helpful. And if we look at the early days of a medical device startup company, right, where to set yourself up for success later, this is of course critical, right? To really figure this out, especially like now when you talk about that there are possibly more than one way that your device can be paid for, and how does that then translate into the commercialization strategy? Maybe you start with
Sure.
patient pay and maybe you do reimbursement later. But to that end, if we talk about the early days and kind of looking into your later strategy for that, what do you recommend startup founders to do and how to approach this topic to kind of figure
Sure.
this out early on?
Well, I think the good news, Axel, is that, in the past, this was kind of a novelty. Nobody really thought about that part of it, about how it was going to get reimbursed by the insurance companies. So I don't think there was a lot of expertise out there. But today, I mean, you can talk to, stakeholders in your business, investors, people who have seen the process for other companies that they've been involved with. You can also talk to the actual users and purchasers and kind of see where their pain point is and what their experience has been with insurance companies. I think it's really key to understand from the reimbursement staff, basically your coders and billers at a hospital or at the clinic, to understand, what has been their experience when they're working with similar kinds of devices. The insurance companies they have to deal with, what are the requirements that they see. Those kinds of things are really helpful. And then, of course, finally would just be, engaging with a reimbursement expert, somebody who is, that's what they deal with every day is all of the ins and outs and how things work.
Right. Yeah. No, that's super helpful. Like we already have touched upon here, reimbursement is a super complex process with a lot of different parts. So if you were to kind of like simplify that, sort of dumb it down to help explain reimbursement, if we kind of look at the things that are most important, what are some of the things that you would lift forward and
Yeah.
explain that in more simple manner?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And hopefully this does help simplify it quite a bit. A lot of my peers talk about either the three pillars of reimbursement or the three-legged stool. I really like the three-legged stool analogy because with a three-legged stool, if you're missing one or more of the legs, it doesn't mean you can't stay on the stool or balance it or whatever. It's just a lot more effort, and there's some risk involved. You might fall on your face. It's very similar on the reimbursement world. Coding, coverage, and payment are those three legs of the stool. And if you are missing one or more of those, it is going to be a challenge, and there are risks, and it's going to be a lot of effort. So, knowing what those three legs are, knowing where the gaps are, knowing what you have to do to get there is vitally important. Just really quickly, I'd like to cover those three legs just to kind of define them. Coding, really simply, we've all heard about CPT codes or ICD-10 codes. Those are the language of reimbursement. That's how providers, when they bill for a procedure, that's how they tell the payer what they've done, what condition the patient has. All of those kinds of things are that communication between the provider and the payer. On the coverage side, coverage is really about the payer's determination of which patients, what conditions, and what devices are reimbursable. And they can create coverage policies that exclude any part of that. So, a device may be covered for one set of indications and not another. Those kinds of things are in coverage policies. And then finally, payment. Payment really is about establishing a level of payment that covers the entire cost of the procedure, including the cost of the device. All services and supplies and staff and all that have to be accounted for, so that the hospital isn't left holding the bag on some part of that service.
Right. Okay. That's great. That's helpful. So going to more specifically for one of these legs of the stool, coding, generally speaking, there are two scenarios, right? Either there is a code that applies or there is no code. So let's start with a scenario where there is a code in existence. Is that all you need to do then, or what do you need to do after identifying that there is a code to make sure it's like truly a fit for your device or procedure?
Okay. Well, this is the consultant in me coming out, but I think it's just vitally important that you take the additional step to verify that that code actually applies to you. It is, one of the major risks, I think, in the insurance world. If you're giving advice to your customers that a particular code can be used for that device, if you're wrong or if there's some misunderstanding, you're putting both your customer and yourself at risk of some pretty significant liabilities, and even potential criminal prosecution. So it is really, really vitally important to make sure that the code actually does apply. I think it's also important then to, understand where does that code fit in the payment system, and how that's going to work for you.
Right. And I guess also from like a payment level perspective, if you look from at this reimbursement code with sort of your own business in mind, right? I assume that different codes pay different amount of money, right? So can you make enough of a money? Is there a business here? Is that a correct thought?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. It it I think the other thing to consider as well is that, while there may be a payment level established today, there are some ways to impact that going forward. And a good example are procedures, some of the cardiology procedures I've worked with, that when they initially came out under their coding that they fit under, the payment level just really wasn't sufficient. But over time, the manufacturer was able to work with CMS and work with other stakeholders like specialty societies, and get that payment level adjusted.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So talking about this three-leg stool analogy and kind of along the same lines of what we just
Mhm.
talked about. So if there is a reimbursement code that applies to your device, but there's more still things that you have to do, right? Other than verifying that it actually applies, there are more things beyond that that you also
Yes,
need to make sure, right?
right,
So what
exactly.
are
So
those some of those things?
yeah. So again, on that three-legged stool, I as a consultant, I've had companies come to me, and they have been told that this code applied, or they were able to verify that a code applied, and their impression was, well, that's all I need to do, right? And frankly, it would be great if that were the case, but many times there's additional work that has to be done to ensure that, for instance, Medicare, do you need or have a national coverage decision that applies for that device? And then what about other payers? Medicare as a total is, maybe depending on the device type and what age group falls under those indications, it could be anywhere from 40 to 60% of your business, but then you still have this other big chunk that are non-Medicare, and making sure that those payers cover as well. There can be a lot of work there, and it starts with determining whether the clinical evidence supports coverage, taking a look at, um, the claims that you're making that you've been FDA approved to make, are those sufficient, or do you need to prove beyond the safety and effectiveness of those claims? Do you need to prove anything additional for those payers? And often what you hear from them is that, well, okay, it may be safe and effective, but it's not medically necessary. So there's a lot of work to do to establish that, make sure that the evidence is all really falling into place. And then finally, we talked a little bit about payment level already, but there are several scenarios there as well. With a given code, the payment level may be sufficient right out of the gate. It could be less than sufficient, or it could be not established. And what do you do in those situations?
Right. And also to clarify there, when you talk about roughly 60% might be CMS and there are other payers, those would be private payers and insurers
Private
like
insurance company.
Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Aetna, and so on and so forth. Okay,
Correct.
awesome.
Correct.
And just a quick follow-up on that end, you would start on the CMS side of things and then later expand to private payers, or
Right.
what is the
Right.
approach?
Yeah, I think the answer is it depends on the device. So I know that one of my previous roles, I had worked on a device that was a stroke prevention device, and it really, the majority of the patients were under 65. So it was, the concern was really not Medicare. It was really those other payers.
Hmm.
So it can really depend on the device and what the indications are for that device.
Okay, that's helpful. So we talked about the scenario now where there is a code, right? And so we can unpack that. Let's talk a little bit about the other side of things, sort of the more, I guess, worst case scenario, right? There is no code. So then what do you do? What does and what can you do, and what would that
Yeah.
entail to head down that route?
Yep. So again, can be a long and complicated process. And it's highly dependent on the clinical evidence that you have for the device. When you go and take a look at establishing a new CPT code, the American Medical Association is the entity that controls that, and they have very specific requirements, including level of evidence requirements for a coding application. And the process is also rather complex. Typically, a CPT code is not applied for by the manufacturer. You need to work with your specialty society and have them submit that application, and then it goes through the CPT, AMA CPT panel, and that whole process. One of the most important things to keep in mind is what the expected timeline for that is.
Right.
And I think just rule of thumb before you look at any of the other expectations is, after FDA approval, it could be 2 years before you have a code in place. And I think that is basically if everything goes well. So it can be a very long time process. The other thing is, what does it take to pull that off? I mean, how much capital do you need? How do you fund that as a startup organization? And while you're trying to commercialize at the same time you're working on this. And I assume there's, a lot of different ways to go after this, for some startups, it may mean that you may need to consider what your competitors are doing. And if they're working on a code already, you may be able to ride their coattails. Or if they have clinical evidence that would supplement your clinical evidence, you may have to take a look at, whether or not that's going to support your application as well. And then finally, in some cases, it may just be that a startup company may have to look at things like acquisitions or something like that in order to take that next step to get that code.
Right. Now going back to where sort of we started off in this conversation here with considering this at an early stage as a startup, right? Is
Mhm.
what you're telling me now, like if you then identify there is no code and you decide that that's what you need to do, go after, of course, then you need to factor in this additional time and
Right.
the additional fundraising that needs
Correct.
to happen for that. So I think this is great insight. So to kind of last sort of question to kind of wrap this up, say that you have gone through that journey, you now have a code that applies, you're out there selling your device, um, all that is good. It's my understanding that you have sort of some sort of expectations or there are things that you have to do as a medical device manufacturer to support your customers in their reimbursement claims, right? It's not like
Right.
they're just going to take care of it. You just say this is the code and then they go off and do that. It's my understanding that you also need to support them in different ways in with those kind of things. Tell me a
Right.
little bit about that and what
Yeah.
are the expectations, what do you need to provide?
Yeah. No, that's another really good question. When you're preparing for a launch, it's really important to understand what the market expectations are. There are some segments of the device industry that provide very high level support to their customers, up to actually having a team that processes prior authorizations and appeals on behalf of the customer to make sure that the device is covered before the procedure even occurs. And that could be a team that is built within the organization. Most startups are probably not going to be in a position for that. So there are entities out there where you can contract a therapy access team that can do that for you, kind of as um, a separate entity. So there's a variety of ways of going about that. But there are, like I said, there are some segments that expect that high level. There are other segments that maybe don't have any expectations at all. And my recommendation would be I think it's prudent for any medical device company that's launching a product to have at least some basic resources there for their customers. There's two reasons for that. One is to make sure that they understand that there is a pathway to get reimbursed and they use the correct coding and all that for that. But it's also, I think, if there ever are any misunderstandings or compliance concerns later on, it's a good way to cover yourself and say, hey, look, I provided the appropriate guidance,
Right.
and to make sure that there's no um, any sort of potential for finger pointing and being able to say, hey, the manufacturer told me to do this when it was clearly wrong. So I think that's a good approach. Other things that you might be able to prov provide that don't require a lot of resources is creating template letters for prior authorizations and appeals. Having some sort of basic hotline support so that providers can call in and ask questions about the process. I think those are all good things to do once you're moving toward being on the market.
Right, right. And again, going back to customer discovery in the early days, as you laid this out as part of your commercialization strategy, just also put this as another line item to figure out, right, what is the expectation for your device and your customers, and then make sure that you know what you need to do once you are in that spot.
Yep.
Great, Steve. Super helpful, insightful. For our audience that want to learn more about this topic, are there any recommendations that you have, any online resources, and how can they work with you? How can they get a hold of you and ask along to get support on this difficult matter?
Sure, sure. Well, certainly contact me directly. My email address is Steve, Steve, at ascalonmarketaccess.com. I think you can can kind of see my logo in the background there, so you can see how that's spelled. Or you can go directly to my website. There is a customer contact page on there. Ascalonmarketaccess.com is the address for the website. From a learning standpoint, again, we talked about the complexity here, and there's so many different pathways that need to be considered. But my recommendation to somebody who wanted to learn more about this is possibly starting with the CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Start with their websites, and it's cms.gov. Make sure you don't go to Medicare.gov, because that's for patient information and how to get Medicare coverage, from your patient. But CMS.gov has just got a wealth of information, and it covers all three legs of the stool. So you can see information about coding and about coverage and about payment policy out there. It's a lot of information, but it's all there. The other thing I would recommend is looking at commercial payers. Go out and search for their medical policy pages. You can pull up medical policies for your device segment or for similar device segments, and you can really get an idea of what the payers, from those policies, what they're looking for from clinical evidence standpoint, what their concerns are about coding. Sometimes those are in the policy. Those are all very helpful as well. And then finally, take a look at manufacturers in your space and take a look at their websites, search for their reimbursement pages and resources. That will give you a pretty good idea of what needs to be provided to your customers.
Awesome.
Those are my thoughts.
Well, thanks so much, Steve. Again, this has been super helpful and insightful in an area that's very, very complex and difficult. So again, I really appreciate your time here today, sharing your expertise and knowledge. So thanks so much for joining me today.
Yep. Thank you, Axel. It was my pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode of Quick Talk, hit like and subscribe. And for additional educational content, visit our website at quickvault.viva.com.